decisions, to forgive ourselves, to begin again. We pray, dear Lord, for those who are connected to each one of us, those out there in the world who may have lost their way. May our loving vibrations reach them with your tenderness, Lord. May you guide us during the talk of this evening to touch the hearts and minds of all those who are ready to hear the message. We thank you, and so be it. Okay. Daniel, do you need me to share the PowerPoint? No? Just open? Okay. Yep. So we've been doing this series of lectures, basically a study, in a sense, a high-level study. We say high-level because each chapter in this book has two parts. First part is 20 chapters. Second part is 20 chapters. So it is truly, although it is a beautiful book and can appear as just a regular average book you could just pick up, read, and put back down, but it really feels like, to some of us, as a sort of textbook in a sense. And we say that in a respectful way, not as a, oh my gosh, it's boring from college, I don't want to read a textbook, but in a way to say that it merits and deserves its own study, in-depth study. So our talk will not be, because we have 1 hour, will not do it justice. We just want to give that disclaimer out of respect for our dear Joanna DeAngelis, the spirit guide of Divaldo Franco, and all the beautiful work that she has done. So I digress. This is chapter 8, or rather, part 2 of the book, chapter 8, Karma and Conscientiousness. For those of you on the web or watching the recorded version of this, go back and watch the other recorded versions. Although we will say this chapter can stand alone, in the sense that you don't have to have watched the other videos, but obviously we recommend it. And of course, we don't physically have the book, but you can purchase this book on Amazon or at Leal Publisher. So, who knows what karma is? Anybody? Action and consequences. So for the sake of this conversation, we want to make it clear that Spiritism, let me go back. Karma is known in many different religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, probably even, as fate. You know, something you've done in the past, and then you're destined to hit a certain fate. Spiritism, we don't believe that. We don't believe that you're destined to reach point B, and that's it. Because you did X, you're gonna get to Z, or because you did C, you're gonna get to I. Thank God, we don't believe that. We do believe that through our own waking or conscientiousness, which we're going to talk about, once we become sort of aware of between what is good and what is not good, we can change our lives. There's plenty of cases, and Joanna in this chapter talks specifically about Mary Magdalene and Judas Iscariot and how their choices affected their quote-unquote karma. Now, again, this might be confusing, perhaps to some, because Joanna uses the word karma, but she likes to be clear and define what it is. And we've shared about these two things at the top here. And Joanna says, therefore, improve your life constantly through positive acts. Create new karmic outcomes, freeing yourself from the painful ones that weigh on your moral economy. And if you're looking for an excellent book that gives the most fascinating cases of action and reaction, which is what in Spiritism we view as karma, in the sense that, not in the sense that there's a destiny or a fate, but that Action and Reaction is actually a book with that name, Action and Reaction. It is a book filled with cases of people that have transgressed the law of God and reincarnated and went on to live better lives. And because of that, it allowed them to sort of pay back some of their debt, if you will. And they're able to, instead of, let's say, for instance, lose an arm, they lost a pinky, so to speak. But if you haven't read Action and Reaction, you're missing out. Really, if you haven't read the Andrea Louise series, you're missing out. But we have Action and Reaction here as well. Is this clear? Karma, action and reaction. We have the ability to change our lives. Just because we may have made mistakes, it doesn't mean that we are destined to, quote unquote, as some religions believe, burn in eternal hell. Praise God. And that's no jab to any belief system. Everyone needs to follow what they feel is important to them, makes them feel whole and closer to God. But for us spiritists, luckily, we believe in action and reaction. Joanna goes on to give a different flavor to our understanding of karma. And as we share, she says, the karma is the effect of actions taken at different stages of the current existence as well as those of the past. Fruit of the planted and cultivated tree, karma has the flavor of the species that typifies the plant. So essentially, that saying, or that in the Bible, when they say a good tree, good fruit, kind of similar. She reminds us in this next few sentences of how our decisions can have positive or negative results. So she says, positive acts produce excellent results, rewarding those responsible with happiness, effectivity, lucidity, progress, and new opportunities for moral, spiritual, intellectual, and human growth, promoting society as a whole. But when we choose the opposite, when we act with foolishness, vulgarity, perversion, rebelliousness, or hatefulness, we reap suffering down the road in the form of trials and complex afflictive expiations meant to set them straight. But the beauty of this is that we can change things around. So if we have set things in motion, let's say, if we can use the example of when you're young, they say young and dumb. We make some decisions that weren't the best. Let's say we decide not to go to college, or we decided to spend all of our savings, or just made decisions that we came to realize didn't benefit us. There's always a new day. There's always opportunities to make our life. Karma, and this is how Spiritism differs from other belief systems. Karma is an ever-changing process that depends on a person's behavior. So, in layman's terms, we hold the key to our own success and happiness. Likewise, we hold the key to our own demise. It's really, to oversimplify this, it's truly our decision. But you might be wondering, and which is good, if you're asking yourselves questions, or if you're finding yourselves ever studying Joanna, that's a good thing. A lot of the time people find Joanna DeAngelis' works too complicated, or she's just too out there. So there are a lot of people that avoid her literature, avoid her books, because it's just it takes a lot of study to truly understand. So this reaction that a lot of people have is good. Joanna, we believe respectfully, and talking to many others who we kind of view as scholars of her work, has said it's the greatest compliment when you're studying the series of Joanna DeAngelis if you're left with more questions than answers. We are meant to think, to ponder, and to not be superficial and read something like, the rose is red. Wow, the rose is red. But to think beyond that. And that's what Joanna is such a great teacher in that sense. So you might have asked yourself, because the name of this chapter is Karma and Conscientiousness. But how does conscientiousness relate to karma? How are they related? Well, she says, and this is important, conscientiousness is not intelligence in the mental sense. It is the ability to set parameters for understanding good and evil, opting for the former, proceeding with balance, and taking into account all latent possibilities, developing one's current resources for the sake of one's process of becoming. Such dormant resources are the presence of God in everyone, waiting for the time to bloom and grow. The conscience on various levels coalesces the programming of future events by which it evolves further. We love this sentence because it's so magnanimous. It's so deep. But in layman's terms, what we plant, we reap later. Joanna just has it in a much beautiful way. When lucidity promotes discernment, the more the divine qualities manifest, increasing one's ability to love and serve. Karma derives from conscious conduct. It has the quality of the level of perception that typifies it. So conscientiousness is not intelligence. So we can see people throughout the world that may not have basic levels of education, yet they are conscientious. It's because it is different. And our ability to wake up, we all have a conscience. Oftentimes it's just latent. Our conscientiousness sometimes we're in a sleeping state. And we're going to talk about that as it pertains to Mary Magdalene as well. And this is sort of a tip, sort of a takeaway that Joanna gives us. Raise your conscientiousness and your karma will be luminous and peaceful, leading you to your plenitude. Question is, and we've discussed this many times before, how do you do that? How do you raise your conscientiousness? Anybody have any thoughts? Gioni says knowing yourself. Okay. Anybody else? Or anybody online, if you're watching, feel free to drop any comments in the chat. Paula? Being consistent with your values, Paula says. Anyone else? Knowing and living according to moral laws. Thank you all for sharing your feedback. It's important to note that self-awareness and conscientiousness are different. Again, because as it relates to conscientiousness is not intelligence in the mental sense. So For us, we view it as something much more deeper at the soul level. So as Wendell shares, living out your values, being connected to them, that is conscientiousness. But how many times have we heard this saying, ignorance is bliss. What I don't know doesn't hurt me. And how many actually know where this phrase comes from? Does anybody know? It's okay if you don't. Truth be told, I know myself. There are a lot of things we say in English, and I'm sure in other languages, that have an origin that we may not even know, but we use it. Ignorance is bliss, but is it really? We've often found ourselves saying ignorance is bliss. Yeah, but only to the ignorant, not to anybody else. But is it really? So ignorance is bliss actually comes from an 18th century poet, Thomas Gray. It's a longer poem, which we're not going to read, but just the specific line that he says, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. But is it really? It is not. And President Thomas Jefferson changed around that quote, which we found to be very deep and telling. And he said, if ignorance is bliss, why aren't more people happy? Well, let's talk about two of the cases from a high level from this chapter that Joanna mentions. Two people who were living in ignorance, but soon came to become conscientious. But they both, after become conscientious, made two very different decisions. One is Mary Magdalene. Most of us know Mary Magdalene. In most Christian-based religions, Catholicism and of the like, they paint Mary Magdalene as a prostitute. And we're not here to argue whether she is or she isn't. I'm just going to share from a spiritist perspective, particularly if you have ever read the book Boa Nova by Chico Xavier and the spirit Humberto de Campos. It is in English now. It's called Good News. You can purchase it on Amazon or at lealpublisher.com. What does Joanna say in this chapter, specifically about Mary Magdalene? She says this: while still ignorant, Mary Magdalene lived in moral promiscuity because her conscience was dormant. Upon meeting Jesus, it awakened, changing her behavior to such an extent that she created the blessed karma of being the first person to see him after he passed away and, as she says here, risen. She was the first person that Jesus appeared to. In the book Good News, chapter 20, at least in the English version, the chapters and page numbers are slightly different in the Portuguese version. Humberto de Campos relays a brief encounter when Mary Magdalene goes to see Jesus because she's so moved by his words. And she says to him, "Master, I have heard your loving invitation to the gospel. I would like to be one of your sheep, but would God even accept me?" And what we will not be sharing, because we don't have the time, and this talk is not meant to focus specifically on Mary Magdalene, but the way that Humberto de Campos paints her in this chapter, he does not call her a prostitute. He calls her a woman who lives a very lavish lifestyle for that time. And you have to understand that in that culture and that religion and Judaism, in olden times, if you were a woman living on your own, unmarried, have no children, you were called a certain name. And on top of that, you had means. She had many admirers that loved to give her things. So for those who were living at that time, viewed her as a prostitute because she had many, as Umberto de Campos tells us in this chapter, she had many patrons that would give her loads of gifts. They would shower her with gifts. And Umberto says that she was so beautiful. She was young, beautiful, and men were just drawn to her. So people painted her in that picture. But as soon as she heard Jesus speak to her and learn about him, her life changed. So she went to him because she wanted to be a follower. But she was very honest and said, am I good enough? And Jesus said something beautiful to her. The Nazarene prophet gazed at her, moved, probing the depths of her thoughts, and replied, Mary, lift your eyes to heaven and rejoice, for you have listened to the good news of the kingdom, and God has blessed you with joy. Could you really believe that anyone in the world has been condemned to eternal sin? What would that say about our Father's love? Have you never seen flowers of spring resting atop a house in ruins? The ruins represent human beings. The flowers are hope in God. Upon all the failures and misfortunes proper to human beings, the paternal blessings of God descend and beckon. Today, you are feeling that new sun illuminating your destiny. Walk now in its light, for love covers a multitude of sins. So he reminds her, it doesn't matter what you've done before. None of us are ever condemned to this eternal hell and fire. So based off of her experience with Jesus, she did a complete 180. And the beauty of this, and in this particular chapter, Umberto de Campos narrates two things that are really interesting to think about. As we think about changing our lives for the better, becoming more in tune with what we say is our values, and to live by them, to know that life doesn't spontaneously become a bed of roses. For Mary in particular, and for many people, even today, she became extremely lonely, particularly for at that time, because women of her type, unmarried, no children, and have a history, was not seen as someone who anyone wanted to be associated with. So after she turned her life around and wanted to follow Jesus, she didn't exactly have friends. Even the disciples in this chapter, Umberto de Campos says, even the disciples were very hesitant to be around her. Although they were at times, but they were very reluctant. There even was a time when two of the disciples, I think it was James and another disciple were planning a trip. And because she was feeling lonely, but she also wanted to go and preach to others about Jesus and the gospel, she approached the two disciples and said, hey, can I come with you? And the disciples looked at each other and were like, no, we cannot be associated with you. So instead of getting angry and screaming and yelling and saying how unjust that was, which it was, in a sense, it was for her, she resigned herself to accept what is. and decided just to go back to her living and to do her best. Soon after that, do any of you know how Mary Magdalene died? Daniel, you don't count. You can't answer because I know you know.
Okay.
Thank you. Does anyone here or on the web who's watching know how Mary Magdalene died? From leprosy? So as Mary Magdalene was sitting in her loneliness, still, despite feeling lonely, continued to pray every day. One day, a crowd of people arrived in her hometown, and they were the lepers who had been pushed out of a previous town. So she was excited to see them and was helping them, and she began to talk to them about Jesus. And she noticed that as she talked to them about Jesus, their eyes lit up. They found hope. So she felt, well, here's my place. This is what I'm going to do. And it's so beautiful because in this chapter, Umberto narrates that there's a people who have oozing sores. And leprosy now is treatable. They call it by a different name nowadays, and it's more rare, and it's treatable with antibiotics. But depending upon which phase of the leprosy you're in, it could be more contagious or not. But in this chapter, they narrate there are people who have leprosy coming up to her who are, oozing, just really you could see the body decaying. And they come up to her because they're so fascinated and they find so much solace in her talking about Jesus that they come close to her, but they don't want to touch her because they know that they're unclean. But she welcomes them and says, come, and she embraces them. And she finds her joy in that. And she indeed lives out the rest of her life in a leper colony, doing what she brought her the most amount of joy, which is talking about Jesus and his message. And soon thereafter, she developed leprosy, and the rest is history. But that's how her life went. And the account is that as she was passing away, she knew she was passing. And she began to sort of fall into sort of like, let's say a sleep or disconnecting from her physical body. She found herself in like this, let's say, like a meadow. And she saw Jesus. And Jesus greeted her and he said, Mary, you did so well. You did well. And I highly recommend if you haven't read this book, either in Portuguese or in English, that you get it. It is, in my own ignorance, and forgive me if this is an incorrect statement, but is the first book that I've read, at least in English, that gives such an in-depth account of more of Jesus's words. So there's books like Jesus in the Home, that Neo Lucio, the Spirit, and the medium Chico Xavier give accounts of Jesus, his conversations. But this book, and you have to understand who Umberto de Campos is real quick. I'm not a historical or really deeply into Brazilian history, so forgive me. But I do know that he was a Daniel journalist when he was living on Earth. A poet, sorry, my bad. But the way he recounts the stories is so great. It's so, I don't know if there's a word in English for it. It's so moving. I digress. There's a second story Joanna shares, a second case. Some of you might be familiar with Judas, the so-called hated disciple, right? He was the betrayer. In Christianity, he's the most unliked, if you will. Joanna says, Judas Iscariot. Although Judas Iscariot was aware of the master's mission, he poisoned himself with the vapors of misplaced ambition. And when he awakened later and hanged himself, he established the dismal karma of wretched reincarnations to repair his dark errors and recovery. There are other spiritist books that are out there that talk about the reincarnations that Judas had after he was Judas, which we're not going to go wildly into, which actually we won't go into at all because there's other aspects of this we're going to touch on. But he did indeed have to suffer. Now, let's just make one thing clear. It's not God going there and making us suffer. We have a conscience, and when we come to the realization, like Judas and Mary did, you come to the realization of what you've done. You take the road of, okay, I've done this, let me just do better, which is what Mary did. And Judas, because of his own thinking, when he realized what he had done, which we'll share a real brief excerpt from the good news about it, instead of thinking as Peter did, and Peter denied Christ 3 times and saying, let me just do better. This was wrong what I did. I shouldn't deny Christ, but let me live the rest of my life preaching his word. But Judas could not, in his mind, tolerate what he had done. So let me share an excerpt. This is when, after Judas was giving up Jesus. And this is in chapter 24 of the English version. Umberto Campos narrates, at dawn, the foolhardy disciple headed for the center of the city, and hours later he was received by the Sanhedrin, where he was guaranteed the most significant promises. For those of you who are not aware, a lot of the movies that talk about Judas talk about the 30 silver coins that he gets, and perhaps a lesser known fact that Umberto Campos shares is that not only was he given the coins, but he was promised a higher position in society. And in Judas's mind, he thought, oh, I'll be granted this higher position. Then, they'll jail Jesus, but then I'll have him freed because I'll be in a higher position. And everyone will notice what Christianity is. Kind of like nowadays when we see celebrities become famous because of really horrible things that they put out there on the web. So Judas kind of had the same idea. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? There are some celebrities that become famous for not so great things, but then everyone knows who they are because these not so great things, and then, they become multi-billionaires. Some of their names rhyme with Ardashian. So, kind of the same thing. It's in Judas's mind, right? Umberto continues to narrate, despite being satisfied with this petty gratification and frenzied in his ambitious spirit, Judas did love the Messiah. He loved him, a little known fact, and eagerly awaited the moment of triumph to give him the joy of Christian victory by means of the political maneuvers of the world. The price of vanity, however, awaited his inordinate ambition. Judas had watched all the anguishing, humiliating scenes of Calvary from afar. Atrocious remorse stung his torn conscience. Burning tears streamed from his sad, lifeless eyes. And they narrate how he walks like a zombie to the fig tree and decides to take his life. And right before he decides, modern day terms, we like to say, he unalived himself. He has that wave of guilt again. But right after that wave, he hears Jesus talk to him. But he already takes his life. And then I think in this book, or it might be in another book, they actually say that after Jesus was crucified, the first thing Jesus did when he was risen was he went to go get Judas. Because he knew the guilt that was literally killed him. And he wanted to, I'm trying to think of the words in English. Wanted to rescue him and hold him in his arms. So there's a beautiful story about that. And it's something that we try to bring awareness to, because so much of Judas's legacy is that he was a betrayer. He was a betrayer in the sense that he was ignorant. He thought he knew better, and he didn't. But he loved Jesus. That is the reason for him taking his life, because he realized. So he became conscientious. He became aware of what he had done. But unlike Mary, he made a different decision. Unlike many of us, or not unlike many of us, like many of us, we are at these crossroads, both like Mary and Judas, staring down the barrel of what we have done in our past and looking towards our future. And it is solely with us to make the decision to go one way or the other. In each of those ways, both for Mary and for Judas, had consequences. When Mary died, Mary Magdalene, she was so fulfilled, despite in actuality dying in a very harsh way. There was no treating leprosy at that time. Your limbs literally were decaying slowly. It's hard to understand what that feels like unless you've gone through it. There are medical books I don't recommend you look at, but you can, of cases. But before we go here, we had to question ourselves, why in this chapter, karma and conscientiousness, why does Joanna pick out Mary and Judas? She probably could have also talked about Peter, because he made some bad decisions. I mean, let us be honest here. All the disciples made some bad decisions. Some big, some small. But the beauty behind it, the beauty behind Jesus, is that despite the fact that the disciples were flawed, he still wanted to work with them. Jesus knew what Judas was going to do. Jesus knew what Peter was going to do. He knew the ins and outs of those around him, but he loved anyway. That is what is most life-changing for people like Mary Magdalene, who lived a life of tremendous pleasure, gratification, luxuriousness. By all accounts, she should have been happy. So imagine a modern-day celebrity living in their castle, or mansion rather, having their whatever famous cars or Mercedes or whatever, their Birkin bags. How many of you even know what a Birkin bag is? Don't worry, it's a good sign you don't know what that is. It's bad for me. So they're really expensive bags. That the most basic bag costs $30,000. Their most expensive is about $300,000. Yeah, it's not that much, right? It's not that much. But imagine, in my mind, I like to think Mary Magdalene, she probably had a Birkin bag at her time. She lived a life. I mean, she had everything given to her because she was beautiful. but she was so unhappy. She yearned for love. She told Jesus, in wanting to justify what she had, how she lived her life, she said, Jesus, I've been searching for love. Isn't there a song, Searching for Love in All the Wrong Places? But that's what she admits to Jesus. I've been searching for it. And even Judas, in his own way, he thought he was doing good. He thought by doing those actions. But then life wakes us up. We become conscious. And that's why reincarnating is so important. We have to go through reincarnation to experience conscientiousness, to awaken. And Joanna ends this particular chapter by quoting the Spirit's book, question 132. What is the purpose of the incarnation of spirits? Does anybody know? Evolution, Gioni says. Anybody else? Why do we reincarnate? To make better what? Better decisions? Dan, you want to hand the mic to our friend next to Wendell? I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
It's another chance that you have to make up for the bad decisions that you have made in the past lives. As the Creator gives us chances of just to correct them and follow Jesus' examples.
Sure. Anybody else? No pressure, Wendell. The mic is in your hand, but no pressure. No pressure.
No, but I think it's what Diony said about evolution through expiation and proving. I mean, recognizing the bad decisions you made in the past and trying to not only make things different from now on, but try to make it up, because sometimes you have to recognize what you did wrong. You have to regret about it, but you have to do something that maybe will repair through somebody. So I think it's all about evolution, of course, but because I think that we can evolve in the spiritual world as well, but not at the same way that we can do it here, because the fact that we don't remember what we did helps us to be in situations that helps us to develop emotions and feelings that we would not able to if we remember what the ones who are around me did to me or what I did to them in the past. So I think there are some circumstances when we are incarnated that help us to repair what we did wrong and try to make things different in the future.
Perfect. Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in? Why were you born? The answer from the wise and noble spirits, they say God imposes incarnation for the purpose of leading spirits to perfection. For some, it is an expiation. For others, a mission. However, in order to reach this perfection, they must undergo all the vicissitudes of corporeal existence. Therein lies their expiation. Incarnation has a further objective, which is to place spirits in situations where they can do their share in the work of creation. It is here where we face the challenges. In many cases of spirits that are incarnating, and again, going back to the Andrea Louise series, but there's also another spiritist books that are psychographed by different mediums that talk about this. But you hear a lot about spirits that are getting ready to reincarnate. They are very fearful because they know where they are. They're in a place of there's a support system, and they're in a space where they're not being tempted. But once they come back to the earth, what happens? Forgetfulness. We come back. There's so many cases like this. Because it is here where that forgetfulness of the past, the information is there. The interesting thing, we talk about forgetfulness of the past, but Joanna DeAndres reminds us that there is not emotional forgetfulness. What does that mean? So I'm sure some of you have experienced this, where you go into a location and you have a feeling about it. Now, this could be because the feeling of the energy that's there in the room, but it also could be from a past. Or if you're interacting with someone in your family and you don't have the best relationship with them, we know through Spiritism that oftentimes it's not just this life, it's all the previous lives that we don't remember, but emotionally the memory is there. That's why there are cases of depression and other psychiatric illnesses that have no explanation. There's a famous case of 2 twin girls, and one twin, they were genetically identical. They were identical twins. And they studied this case, these 2 twins, for years. One twin, she had the most severe case of depression. No idea. She had no history of abuse. She lived a very comfortable life. Her family was upper to middle class, very loving parents, supportive family, and just by all means, she shouldn't have been depressed. And she was beautiful. But she had such bad depression that they actually, which is not very common, but they still do this, they did electric shock therapy on her. Because they didn't know. This has probably happened, the original story, I think I read it about 15 years ago. But we're sharing this because there was no earthly explanation why this young, beautiful, vivacious girl, her twin, complete opposite to her, did not experience any feelings of depression, anxiety, nothing whatsoever. They lived quite identically, as a lot of twins do. They shared everything. They lived their experiences together. So they couldn't figure out why. But from a spiritual perspective, we can say, well, perhaps she brought something with her, that emotional memory. But I digress. Joanna shares at the ending of this chapter, she says, karma and conscientiousness go hand in hand, the former being the result of the latter. Therefore, improve your life constantly through positive acts, create new karmic outcomes, freeing yourself from the painful ones that weigh on your moral economy. This is the main takeaway. Let us leave here today, if we haven't already, constantly trying to be better. Positive acts, which can encompass a great deal of things. That is what unchains us from our own so-called karmic debts, which are nothing more than our own, oftentimes, or associated with the guilt that we feel. And we can see this in modern day because this can happen to us on a day-to-day basis. There was a famous, he's still alive. There is a famous Brazilian DJ. He's international. His name is Alok. Anybody know him? I mean, not personally, nobody knows it, but his story is really interesting. We actually did get to meet him in Miami for like 2.5 seconds. He lived his life, and everyone knows how luxurious of a life he lives, right? Has a lot of money. And then he ends up getting to a bad situation and something bad happens. I think it was maybe a plane crash or almost plane crash. He decides to turn his life around, completely has this like literal and visceral awakening, this conscientiousness of like, he's like, I want to change my life. So he begins to live, and still lives his life, although he doesn't seem to really advertise this a lot, but he does a lot of charity work. He does a lot of good for others. And I saw an interview where he was explaining that after he had this moral awakening, he came to the realization of all the good he can be doing in his day-to-day life. Just in the simplest of things, because he was sharing that I meet so many people, like all the time. And there's so many things that in my past I probably could have done, but I didn't. But now with this awakening after that he lives his life with much more purpose. And you might have even seen, or maybe not, there is an organization called Fraternity Without Borders. I don't know the name in Portuguese, I forget. There you go.
Fraternidade Sem Fronteira.
There you go. So one of the things that he did was dedicate himself to that organization. He had gone to Mozambique and volunteered his time. I say all this to say, it's just an example that we can look at and think about as someone who changed their life around and decided to be more intentional with the positive acts in his life. But any of us and all of us can make these small changes for the better. That is the end of this particular lecture. And Daniel, do we have any comments online, or anyone else here want to share any comments or questions?
I do have a question. No, we don't have any comment online yet. Thank you so much, Kirsten. That was wonderful reminder about this topic, karma. My question is, often we relate to karma as a negative thing, right? But is there such thing as positive karma? What is that? Karma?
Dharma, the deed.
Yes, so...
Yes. So karma, restating it, is just action and reaction, right? There's actions and there's consequences for those actions. So there's positive things that can happen. So yeah, we could say positive karma. It does have a negative connotation to it. But I think we are so guilt-ridden as a society. And I always remember this. I saw a bumper sticker years and years and years and years ago when I used to live in Philly that said, if you feel guilt for no reason, you're probably a Catholic. So I always remember that, because it's that inner Catholic, or not that I didn't grow up Catholic, I grew up Spiritist, but it's that inner sensation of guilt sometimes we carry with us. We tend to have this looming picture of ourselves that even when good things happen, we're like, oh, why do I deserve this? But a lot of it, the good that does happen, is because we've done good things. You know? If good things are happening to us, it is good to be grateful. It is good to acknowledge, like, okay, maybe I'm doing something right. I'm doing some things right. Maybe not everything, but some things I'm doing right. Joanna always reminds us to love ourselves and to have compassion. She has a lot of literature that she has written in her books where she spends a great deal of time wanting to impress upon us how important it is for us to forgive ourselves, to have compassion for ourselves, because we don't do that enough. Sometimes we don't even do it for other people, but really we don't do it for ourselves, especially if you're a mom. But other people too, everybody. I mean, not just calling out moms, but I would say sort of a human condition. But thank you, Daniel, for sharing the question. Anybody else have any comments?
Any comment or question? Paula?
Hold it close, it works? Okay. I just wanted to, thank you, that was a wonderful talk. I just want to follow up on the positivity end, because it's true, we're always working on correcting our faults, becoming more aware of our tendencies, doing, I'm not saying these are bad things to do, doing good acts of service for other people. But the very simple awareness that happens when we wake up in the morning, like how enthusiastic am I to have another day on this beautiful planet? And if I'm lower on that scale, then that probably is the first thing to work with, asking for our spirit guide's help. Because being here, I know we stood in line a long time to get here, and it really is a blessing, even in the midst of the storm, that we're here. Thank you.
Great reminder. Absolutely. I'm always reminded, and apologies for talking a lot about Joanna. She's someone that we read a lot. But when Joanna talks about St. Francis of Assisi, she always paints him in the most beautiful way. And we've shared this before, how the way Francis of Assisi led his life, he led his life looking at the world around him with an enchantment. And I always like to equate it with a Disney movie. Have any of you ever watched Cinderella? Okay. Cinderella, and she wakes up in the morning, the birds are singing, they come at her on her bedpost. Even the little mice in the house love her, and she loves them, and she brings them food, and she cares for them. St. Francis was this same way. He would talk to animals. He could tame them, even ones that were not really, shouldn't have been tameable. He lived his life that even as the hot iron was burning his cataracts, because that's how they treated cataracts back in the century that he lived in, he was literally blessing the iron and the fire that was about to burn his eyes. And we're talking about, there's no, I don't know, other than maybe some very basic herbs, there was no anesthetic at that time. Again, other than basic herbs. So you can imagine him kneeling and saying, "Oh, blessed iron. I don't know about you, but I'm not at the level quite yet where I am blessing any of my struggles just yet. But I always remind myself to be more like Francis, St. Francis of Assisi, and lead our lives with enchantment." We often make fun of, people that, like Cinderella, was like living this in this bubble of life. But we can live that way. Life is beautiful. We don't have to have this perspective. And the only reason that we do, as Paula was saying, is because we lived so many lifetimes with these types of thoughts. And even Mary of Magdalene, when she was going to Jesus, and she was like, "Oh, Jesus," complaining and looking at her life in a miserable way. And he was like, "No, God loves you. Change your perspective. It is work. It is work." But thank you, Paula. Anybody else? Wendell? No hard questions, okay?
Oh, no.
Okay. Just
I
kidding.
wasn't.
I'm just
I wouldn't
kidding.
be able to. Can we assume then, relating a karma to our reincarnation program that happens in the spiritual world before we come back here? Can we assume that we can change this program by how useful our acts and thoughts and behavior are to the achieving of our spiritual program through expiations and missions?
Absolutely. So thank you for the question. That was fantastic. So I think there is a misunderstanding. We often, when we hear reincarnatory plan, we often might think of a very specific and detailed plan for our lives. Like, Wendell's going to go to church. Wendell's going to meet this person. Wendell's going to cross the street, trip, get bubble gum, drink hot tea, and y brigadeiro. So, but it's not so descriptive or proscriptive, I should say. Our reincarnatory plan is more so like this. Wendell needs to learn how to accept being bald. So whatever experiences, and I say that in jest, but whatever experiences we need to experience to help us to learn that particular thing, we will experience. And I'll give you a great story that Givaldo, not story, it's something that he said. Givaldo Franco, the great Brazilian spiritist medium, I think he might have been quoting Joanne or someone else, but I digress. He says that a lot of the time in our lives, we're in a difficult situation and we think, well, I'm going to leave the situation. I'm going to move to North Carolina where my life is going to be changed. And Givaldo was saying, we can definitely move away, live in a different city, rebrand ourselves, change everything about us. But what we must experience and learn, we must experience and learn. So maybe we're not going to have that same set of circumstances. It'll be different, but still will be tailored to the needs that we have to learn. That's why it is so beneficial for us to learn resignation. So in the Gospel according to Spiritism, there's a chapter, I think it's a subchapter called Obedience and Resignation, which we're not going to get wildly into, but that chapter had this most illuminating conversation. And I brought this here before, and she's actually here today, not to embarrass her. But B and I were having this discussion one day. B, you probably don't remember it. It was very brief. But this having experienced difficulties in life and struggles, and when you come to this realization where you just resign yourself and accept what is, there's a peace in that. And that peace allows us to experience that experience as we need to, instead of fighting it, as we often do. So yes, we can change our life plans for the better because they're not so descriptive or they're not specific. Like, I need to come back as a yoga instructor and marry Vlad. Well, I might come back as something else and marry somebody else. But it's about the experience that I need to go through. So thank you for that.
Any other question, comment? It's now or never, right?
It's now or never. There's a song like that.
There is a song about
it's
that,
now
right?
or never. All right, folks. Thank you all so much for being here. For those who watch it on the web as well, thank you so much for your participation. We are now going to close this part of our meeting today. And Daniel's going to be playing some soft music. Daniel, I don't think I need the mic anymore, right? Now we go to, now as we transition to our moment of passes, this is where we have workers here at the SSB, Spirit Society of Baltimore, where we offer this therapeutic technique, as well as we offer fluidic blessed water, which essentially it is spring water, but we believe that it is also blessed water. If you're comfortable and feel more inclined to view it as holy water, so be it. No one's going to judge you for it or think that you're crazy, but it's just water that's blessed.